Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my favorite quilt research story with you. It begins with soft covers for hard times, but it continues very quickly into a story about the Chicago World's Fair in 1933, a quilt contest to end all quilt contests. And what you see on the right is a quilt that I actually own, and it will be part of the slide lecture. You'll notice that it was not found when the book was published, but here it is in front of your eyes. And part of the fun of this is the search for that particular quilt. We call it the bird's eye view of the Chicago World's Fair. We're going to have a few images from soft covers for hard times. Let's see. I wonder if we could turn off, Jerry, the can lights. Yes. What do you think? I think it would be brighter if we turned out most of the lights up here in the front. Okay. They will go off, yeah. It's just for a minute they're going to take. Where I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, there were hard times. There were hard times all over the country, but a lot of people said to me, we didn't even know what the Depression was. We were just going on with our lives. And quilts definitely softened the hard edges. This is a string quilt. A string quilt is a type of quilt made of scrap fabrics. A string is, in the South, a piece of fabric that is the tiniest piece of scrap left over from a sewing project. And it's kind of pickup work. You make blocks out of them. They are made on a newspaper foundation backing. And it's fun to see the back of this particular string quilt. It is advertising a movie at the Tennessee Theater in downtown Knoxville, and the Midday Merry-Go-Round, which was a country music stage show that happened every day in downtown Knoxville. This is how people did get through the Depression. Movies, Cokes for 10 cents, etc. I remember in soft covers for hard times going out to visit Viola Webb. I was encouraged to go visit her because she had won the state fair in Tennessee with her cotton sack quilts. She made her quilts from cotton sacks that Flour and Feed had come from, and this was a blue ribbon that she won at the fair. She said, a quote I remember from her, she said, we were trying to make something do something. We're recycling. And then Georgia Mize of Sevierville, Tennessee, her first quilts she made were for her dolls and for her cats. She made this quilt, and it was in the book. It's a wedding ring, and it hung in the Knoxville Museum of Art in a beautiful, brand new modern space. And when the newspaper reporter asked her, well, what do you think about your quilt being shown in there? She said, that's exactly where it belongs. She never used this quilt. It's almost pristine. I asked her, she said, Mary Kay, we were so poor, we didn't even have scraps. And I said, but Georgia, where did this come from? She said, well, my sister worked for a WPA sewing project in downtown Knoxville, working at the Red Cross. And on the weekend, she'd come home with a bag of scraps that she had picked up off the floor, and I made this quilt from it. This is Aretha Irwin holding she lives in Andersonville, Tennessee. She's holding an Ann Orr beautiful applique quilt. And I said to her, Aretha, how did you get Good Housekeeping magazine, where the Ann Orr pattern was advertised? How did you get it out here? And she said, honey, we subscribe to culture. Now, it took maybe a 2 or 3 hour interview, and that isn't always how they sounded, but those are the little kernels that I remember. And I look at them now, and they all have passed away. Those interviews were done in 1989. And then I like to tell a story on myself, because this quilt is one I especially liked. I wanted it to go on the cover of Soft Covers for Hard Times. I just thought it conveyed the feeling of the pastel colors that quilts incorporated in the 1930s. And it fit on the format, and the book designer said yes. So I had to write a caption, and I looked for the quilt pattern, and I couldn't find it. And so I said, oh, we'll call it New York Beauty Variation. And lo and behold, after the book was published, I found the clipping. And it was a Capper's Weekly magazine. That's a farm magazine. Came out in the 1930s. And this pattern was featured, and it was called Rocky Mountain Springtime. Pretty far from, well, anyway, it's a lovely, the text of the pattern has a lilting kind of sound. You know, it's springtime everywhere, let's make a quilt. And to think about the people were reading this kind of materials, making quilts like that in face of the hard times, I think conveys pretty well what was going on. I wanted to show you this very important find that I located during the Soft Covers for Hard Times research. We were looking, I was told by someone at the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is headquartered in Knoxville, Tennessee, an organization, a New Deal organization that was established during the 30s, originally a flood control program and an economic development effort. I was told that there were African American workers building dams in northern Alabama for the TVA. And their wives lived with them, African American women. And they decided, where were they going to live? And even though it was a US government program, they decided to abide by the local customs, and they had segregated housing. So there were cabins with families of African Americans and cabins with white workers. Ruth Bond, seen here, this is the full quilt. Ruth Bond was an African-American woman, and her husband, Dr. Max Bond, came from California to Alabama. They were hired by the Tennessee Valley Authority to serve as a personnel manager and work with the African-American families. Ruth kind of gravitated towards the women. She noticed the women were making quilts, but they were making what she called, not my words, what she called typical, kind of not very interesting quilts, like Grandmother's Flower Garden, Double Wedding Ring, etc. And she thought, why not give them something different that expressed what was going on in their lives right then? So according to her, she designed this panel on brown wrapping paper, sketched it out, gave it to 4 or 5 women who were quilting, and they made it in applique. And we have found 5 quilts in this pattern. But when I wrote Soft Covers for Hard Times, it was just this one quilt. It was chosen as one of the top 100 quilts of the 20th century. Designed by Ruth Bond, but she was not a quilt maker. She had an art background, but she was not a quilt maker. This was made by Grace Tyler. And I did go talk to Grace Tyler. She was still alive when the book was published. And I said to her, this picture was taken in her bedroom, this one back here. She at first showed me kit quilts, cross-stitch quilts, broken star quilts, and everything she thought I would like, a pansy quilt. And then she rolled back, I saw this, and I went, whoa, what is this? And I don't like to put words in people's mouths, but I said, what does this mean? And she said, oh, I don't know, Mrs. Bond just gave us the design, and we went ahead and did it. Now I see a white hand coming in from the side. I see a man in the center holding a guitar. I see the sun coming. I see symbolism galore. And when you look at the quilt full on, look at what's happening on the right side. There's a face looking down from the upper right side, and a bosom, a woman's bosom, and her hip and her hand kind of holding onto that guitar or ukulele. And so when I finally met Ruth Bond, here she is, standing in front of a second quilt, I asked her, the artist, I said, you know, what does this mean? And she said, oh, it meant the man in the center was choosing between the life of frivolity and the U.S. government that was giving him a job. And I said, well, what are we to think? What did he choose? And she said, that's up to you. And I said, it reminds me a lot of Aaron Douglas's work. Aaron Douglas was a Harlem Renaissance artist. He was living in Tennessee, and northern Alabama was not far away. But she said, and then I also said it looked like Matisse. She said, well, it also looks like Matisse. And I said, yes, and I looked, but she claims that she did it herself. She came up with the design, and I have to believe her. We have found 2 more since then. I don't know where, and then Grace Tyler would not allow her quilt to be exhibited in the Soft Covers for Hard Times exhibit, but this one was. This is the one that you just saw in front of Ruth Bond's house. And she had 3 trial blocks. You can see them on the right. And they too have caused quite a lot of interest. So that was a really important research project for me, and I've been very proud of it. She recently died at 101 years old in New York City, and they had a 2-column obituary about her. And they Googled her name, and what comes up? Something about her quilt. And so the headline, you know, focuses on her quilt design. But in fact, after they left the TVA, they spent a career traveling around the world. He was the president of university in Liberia. They worked for the State Department in Afghanistan. She started women's projects all over the country. And yet, in the end, because she got published in a book, it was the quilts that they were talking about. I felt very proud of that. And now I want to share with you the ongoing story of the Chicago World's Fair. In the Soft Covers for Hard Times book, Barbara Brackman had started research on this fair, this 1933-34 fair, when she lived in Chicago. I lived in Chicago from 72 to 77, and she arrived right soon after that. And she had heard about this contest, a quilt contest in connection with the World's Fair, had started at that time looking for the top 30 winners in small towns all over the country. When I wrote Soft Covers for Hard Times, she said to me, or I decided on my own, I was going to look for the winners from the Southeast. And I was going to look at the Atlanta regional contest for aspect of that fair. And so I did find 4 or 5 new quilts that she hadn't seen before. And then after the book was published, she said, let's do a book together. And so we revisited it, and we really dug in, and we wrote a book called Patchwork Souvenirs of the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. It was published in 1993. At the time, we had 95 quilts that we knew about. There were entered in this contest 24,000 quilts. Now, this is a poster for the Chicago World's Fair. Those are the dates that summer of 1933. It was repeated again in the summer of 1934. It was held on the lakefront of Chicago. This is not the Devil in the White City World's Fair of Chicago. That was the 1893 World's Fair. And 40 years later, they decided to repeat, or hoped for the success of that 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. 1833 and 1933 was a special year for Chicago because it was their 100th anniversary. But they wanted to focus on modern architecture and everything modern. And so, but the problem was there was the Depression, and they worried that people would not travel from distant points in the United States to Chicago. So Sears decided to offer a contest. Sears Roebuck and Company was headquartered in Chicago. They had their mail order office, their main mail order office in Chicago. They offered a contest with a total package prize of $7,500. They offered the grand prize was $1,000. You could buy a decent house for that, a really fancy car. It was a bit like Powerball. You know, people thought, if you don't enter, you're not going to have a chance at this. So a lot of quilt making went on. And you can see here in the mail order office in Chicago, they are deluged with quilt packages. And we have two men, executives of Sears Roebuck and Company. One is their PR man, and they have magnifying glasses. They're counting the stitches in this particular square foot of cloth on the quilt, and they multiply it, and and then they go by 24,000, and they estimated millions and millions of hours had gone into the number of quilts that were entered. People have asked, did they open all those boxes? I think they probably did. Remember, this is a mail order company. They were used to keeping track of things and getting things back out. The grand prize winning quilt, I'm going to jump the story. The grand prize winning quilt was given to Mrs. Roosevelt. She was a brand new First Lady. Mr. Roosevelt had become the president in March. They used to have inauguration in March back then. So March 33, he was the president. And here at the end of the summer, in October, mid-October, she is receiving the quilt. Again, from the man on the right is the same man who was in the picture before, the PR man from Sears. The story goes that this quilt was made by it's a true story. Miss Margaret Rogers Kaden entered this quilt, and she accepted the prize of $1,000. But in eastern Kentucky, there were at least 3 women who knew they had made this quilt. She owned a cottage industry and had a store in Lexington, and she employed professional quilters. They made the quilt. They were paid about $25 for the work. Never got credit, except when we went to Kentucky to kind of track down this story. They said to us, you know, our mothers, our aunts couldn't complain because they needed the continued work. They were supporting their families during the Depression by quilt making for Miss Kaden. After the fair, they put out patterns of the winning quilts, and this is one of the publications. That is the Sears building at the fair, the Sears Pavilion. About this time, Sears was opening department stores at 1 or 2 a month. There were 400 department stores around the country. And for the contest, you entered your quilt at your local department store, and at that level, the top 3 winners were chosen. And of those top 3, then it went to the region. And there were 10 regional mail order offices. As I said, in the Southeast, it was Atlanta. And Chicago was the main one, Memphis, Boston, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Seattle, Minneapolis. And this is the only real picture, black and white picture taken of it full out. This is the grand prize winning quilt. It's in greens. It's in shades of green and print. What we think thrilled the judges was there's trapunto work right in here, and there's trapunto work along the side. Trapunto means raised work, and I think it showed it was an innovation at the time. And it thrilled the judges, I guess. There she is on the right side, Miss Margaret Rogers Kaden. This is the back page of the Sears Roebuck catalog the next year. We think that Mrs. Roosevelt knew what was going on here. because she knew Lexington very well. She traveled often in the Southeast, especially looking for crafts. And she was not thrilled with this quilt, and it has disappeared. And it is one of the great challenges of quilt history to find this quilt. Now, on this page, it gave all the regional winners for each region and their hometowns. And so that's how we found some of these quilts. And we have a few to show you. This is Margaret Langley's quilt from Dallas, Texas. It turns out it's a pattern called Martha Washington's Rose. And there's a close-up of it. Now you can see that this is excellent quilting. And you can, I can understand why they would give this a prize. This one was made by Celia Hyde Pardue, and it's called Louisiana Rose. Her initials are in the bottom left-hand corner, Celia Hyde Pardue, and interestingly, it says 1932. There wasn't anything that said it had to be a brand new quilt, but it's interesting that she made it the year before. They had 4 months to make these quilts, and she had one already finished. It seems that she was a little ahead of the game. And this is a bowl of flowers. It was the first quilt for the woman who made this. It won 3rd place in Dallas. And those are her ribbons. The ribbon on the left is a green ribbon. It's kind of an honorable mention ribbon that quite a few people received. And I have gotten more phone calls than otherwise saying, we have a blue ribbon. And I'm saying, right. And then sure enough, it turns out it's green, and it's that shape exactly. This is one that I think is spectacular. It won 1st place in Los Angeles. It was also a first quilt made by Edith Matthews and of Nevada, Winnemucca, Nevada. Just fabulous, swinging around. Now, as we look at this one, it's important to note that Sears offered a bonus if your quilt was in the theme of the World's Fair, the Century of Progress. And this woman actually named this quilt Century of Progress. It looks like an art quilt today. She didn't use she's definitely breaking some rules of the time in her color choices. There's no border to it. It's really, I think, a very modern looking rendition. This won 1st place in Memphis, Tennessee. It's called Lincoln's quilt, Lincoln's favorite. It was a pattern by Ann Orr. And Ann Orr lived in Nashville, Tennessee. She wrote for Good Housekeeping magazine. She was one of the judges for the contest. So, and she announced in her column in January in Good Housekeeping that she would be the judge, and she just so happened to give several nice patterns, and several of them did end up in the final 30 quilts of her designs. This is a newspaper clipping from Philadelphia. And those of you in my class are probably going, yeah, I know what that is in the upper left. We've had a week-long class and looking at patterns. The quilt in the upper left won 1st place in Philadelphia, and it was a Vermeeren design. Hubert Vermeeren lived in Des Moines, Iowa. He put out kits and patterns, and that is bright yellows and oranges. And the one on the right in the bottom, the quilt that you are partially able to see, is a Ann Orr design called Autumn Leaves. And in the center of this quilt, and these are people from, center of this photo, another Ann Orr quilt, Autumn Leaves. These are the 3 winners in Kansas City. One of them is from Nebraska. One of the quilts on the right is from Nebraska. We have not found this quilt. We understand that the owner has moved to California a long time ago. But aren't these lovely ladies? These are not the quilt makers. These are the League of Women Voters. These are the Garden Club ladies, and they judge the quilts. And these were their choices. Here is, now for the book, Patchwork Souvenirs, we had not found the color picture. We had not found the quilt. But since the book came out, we located this quilt. And I think I didn't even notice in the black and white photo that it has prairie points across the bottom. I just assumed it would be green. Instead, it's this pink color. And this is a rare, most of Ann Orr's designs do not use printed fabric, but this one does. And a lot of people commented on this quilt, and at the time when the exhibit was held at the World's Fair site, and in a way it became the people's favorite. And before Barbara began doing the research, there was a quilt like this at the Denver Art Museum that said it was the winner of the Chicago World's Fair, but they had even the wrong date. They had 1893 and not 1934. This is a long time ago. She cleared that up. Now, Sears offered, as I said, a bonus of $200 if the grand prize winning quilt was in the theme of the Century of Progress. And this couple made the Riebenstorffs, and they're from Wisconsin, and they took the challenge. And it says, a grand winner can get $1,210. All of the regional winners will be exhibited in the Sears building at the Century of Progress, which opens in June. The quilt winning the grand prize will be presented to the First Lady of the land at the White House. If the design is an original one, here we go, talking about the one on the right. If the design is an original one commemorating the Century of Progress, an additional bonus of $200 will be awarded. Thus, the grand national winner can collect a total of $1,210. Now, these people did. They decided we're going to take the challenge. He was out of work. They both worked hard on the research of this quilt. In the center is the Sears building from the World's Fair. Standing on it is Lady Liberty with that links to the 1893 World's Fair, what she's holding on the top. I think the colors are a little unusual. Their choice, they did a lot of shading with the 2 or 3 different applique, using applique. What they were doing in each block, for example, here they're looking at an early form of photograph and a radio. They were looking at technology. So they chose technology. Here's a Century of Progress quilt, hoping to win an extra $200. That is Century of Progress, Chicago, June 1933, with a lovely border. And in the center is the Sears building. So where are they getting this Sears building? Probably from the cover of the contest brochure. In the air, we have a small plane, and the latest on the right, the latest modern vehicle at the time was this dirigible. And you know that a few years later, one burned up in New Jersey, I think it was, and that was the end of the future for dirigibles. But it's interesting to look at, in 1933, this was the future in air travel. In the bottom right-hand corner, there is a tag still attached. You see it right there? Yeah, I kind of look over there too. Okay. There's a tag still attached. And every quilt entered in the contest had a tag attached. Name, address, the name of the quilt, how much you would give if somebody, how much, if you wanted to sell it, how much you would charge for it, and things like that. So, but I always, and the next one, whoops, we're going backwards. I tell people, if you have a 1930s quilt, be sure to look in the bottom right-hand corner for evidence of that tag. A lot of just regular 30s quilts were entered in this contest. Think of 24,000 of them. And I'm sure that they just took off those tags when they came home. But this quilt was probably put away in a closet and never shown again. The Riebenstorffs, there is a wonderful oral history that they're the ones who did the brown and white one with the face of Edison. There's a wonderful oral history that's been done, the two of them explaining everything on that quilt, and it was done by the Wisconsin Historical Society. And they said that it wasn't finished, they didn't get it quilted, but they decided to take it to Chicago anyway to be judged. It didn't get any attention, and so they brought it home and put it in a closet. Now, there's the next one, again, 1833, 1933, and it's looking at various forms of transportation, all in applique, and there's some white embroidery thread on it. Her name is right here, but look right there in the bottom. There's a tiny piece of tag that is still visible. This was in our book, so I noticed that. But I found quite a few of those in my little trekking along. And this was done by Aurora C. Dyer of Chicago. And notice what she's done, 1833, 1933, the Sears building in the center, Fort Dearborn in front. She's taken a block called World Without End that was published by by one of the, I think it was well anyway, it was published in the newspaper in Chicago. And she's created, I think, a really interesting format. And this ended up on the cover of the book. Here is her tempera drawing, her design for that quilt. Now, I personally think that Sears, none of these quilts really won the prize. The judges turned up their nose at them, and they didn't move them on to the next level. And there was a woman named Ida Stowe who entered one of these quilts. And she complained to Sears, and she said that she told them that she didn't think Mrs. Roosevelt would like the choice of the judges if she had seen the others. I told Miss Wilford I did not think that Mrs. Roosevelt is on charity or that she will appreciate the selection of the judges, especially if they could have seen what they had to choose from. Of course, she said, she had no control over them, the judges. That was May Wilford. But this is Ida Stowe. So Ida Stowe became this letter is, we had the copy of the letter. It was written to Sears. It just kind of floated around among quilt historians. And we never knew who Ida Stowe was, what she looked like. This is the quilt on the book. And then one day, this is the exhibit, Patchwork Souvenirs, when it was in Knoxville. And here's the interior. That quilt on the left is called Star Arcturus, and it was made after, or the pattern came out after the fair. And it was put out by Nancy Cabot, a newspaper columnist in Chicago. But now here comes the story where it ties in with the Jameses and IQSC. Barbara Brackman was in town was actually in Knoxville with me, staying at our house. We got a call from California, a man saying he had the Ida Stowe quilt. And I said, how do you know it's the Ida Stowe quilt? And he said, the tag is still on it. I said, okay. And see, I don't know what it looks like. And he said, I said, how did you find out about this? He said, well, I bought this quilt because of the Art Deco look. And I was giving it to my friend, and I have another friend who's a quilt enthusiast, and he had just seen our book, Patchwork Souvenirs, and he looked in the index, and there was Ida Stowe. So I said, well, send me a picture. And the next day, this quilt shows up, or the picture shows up. And I went, oh my gosh, it's in our book. And it does have the tag, Century of Progress, Quilt Contest, Ida Stowe. The name of this pattern is A Century of Progress. When was this quilt made? May 1933. If anyone attending the exhibit wishes to purchase this quilt, I would be willing to sell it for, and there was no amount. Now this is important. I certify that this quilt is entirely of my own making and that it has never been exhibited previously. Miss Kaden, who won the grand prize, signed this quilt, signed this same tag. Ida Stowe is signing it with her address. What did I do? Well, okay, first of all, it's wonderful, close up. What did I do? I called Robert James, right? I called him that night and I said, are you interested in a Sears quilt? Because the man was not, he didn't want to talk to me. He said, I want to sell it. And I said, well, I'm not, it belongs in a museum. And so they did, I don't know what happened, but they talked over the phone. And I said, but please, once the whole thing is done, send it to me. And we'd like to at least display it once. And so we did display it in Knoxville, and then it came to International Quilt Study Center. So it's in the storage. It is very, very fragile. It's gray. I think you're looking at this and maybe thinking it's white. It's kind of a gray steel crepe. I bet somebody's already tested the fibers, but it's really a gorgeous quilt. So that was found. And then this is a picture, a photo that is in our book. And look what is in the back. I mean, she was already in our book with her quilt before we discovered this quilt. Now, the picture you're looking at is 1934. Sue Roberts, who was the organizer of this exhibit in 1933, sent all 30 quilts back to the owners. And here, lo and behold, the fair was resumed again in 1934. She had nothing to show. So she, and the one quilt was already at Mrs. Roosevelt, at the White House with Mrs. Roosevelt. So she called or she contacted the top winners, and they agreed to send their quilts. So we have a picture of 9 quilts, the top 9 quilts on display, and then Sears took these pictures in 1934, and then in the gallery just next to it, they had all these Century of Progress, one-of-a-kind, original designs shown. And my thought is that they decided to make amends. And what's neat is that these are the only ones that Sears Archives really has a lot of pictures of. This quilt on the left has shown up. It's in green with white lettering, and it's in the collection of the Illinois State Museum. The next one is one we're still looking for, and you could see that later. We know where the Ida Stowe quilt is right here. We don't know where the others are. Here's Ida Stowe. As soon as I asked, why didn't the family want to keep this quilt? And it had come from her granddaughter, and I contacted the granddaughter, and she said, well, I just didn't like it. I had nothing to do, with it. She lived in Montana, and I said, I'd love a photo of her. And she said, well, contact my father, who lives in Nashville, Tennessee. And he was the son of Ida Stowe. And I said, whoa, what was going on in 1933 in your family? And he said, well, I was in Greece. He ended up being a classics professor at Vanderbilt. And he said, but she was a real tough woman, and she was always out there fighting for the schools and fighting for the rights of, herself and others. And I said, do you have a photo? And he said, no, but my son does, and he lives in Knoxville, Tennessee. Steve Stowe is his name. I see him regularly now. He was an engineer in Oak Ridge, and he ended up being a director of a museum in Oak Ridge. And we always chuckle about his grandmother. And so he provided this photo. that I took a picture. And here's the quilt again. 1833, 1933, Chicago. That swoosh, they call it nowadays, became the logo of that fair. The quilting in the borders has lots of things going on in it. There's lettering across the bottom. There are buildings. There are railroads, trains, and lots of things. And then we have another of my favorite people, Emma Leonard. She too has a quilt in the International Quilt Study Center. 1833, 1933. Now, artists and Robert purchased this before it came here, and they are the ones who loaned it to the Patchwork Souvenirs exhibit, and I've been indebted to them both for this. I think it's just a beautiful quilt. She was a teacher. She lived in Jacksonville, Illinois. She was known as a birder and a gardener. They say that there's a garden in her name. I've often thought that if they wanted a block to typify or to symbolize that century of progress, this would be it, the skyscrapers and the cabin. It's in sateen, it's beautifully quilted. It has been shown many times, and I think even in Japan, since it's been in this collection. So back to the Sears Archives pictures, we're still looking for these. And I'm still looking for this one. Imagine what this looks like in color. Wigwams in the border, then arrowheads, then the stockade, I'm thinking browns and reds. In the center of that are flames from representing the Chicago fire. Inside the oval, you see in the very center, the Sears building, sailboats on a blue lake in the front, skyscrapers in the back. Where is this quilt? We don't know. These are the 9 winners that were shown in 1934, and we've not found this one. It was from Minneapolis. This one is, again, a Vermeeren design, Star of France. It was made by Susie Combs, and it won first place in Atlanta. There you have the Autumn Leaves by Mary Hilliker of Coral Junction, Missouri, an Ann Orr design. There's the one from Dallas you saw. There's the Spectrum, Edith Matthews. This is one, I think, from Seattle. That's from Philadelphia. And there's the one from Memphis. And I think I'm right, there's only 9 there. Or am I seeing Star of the Bluegrass? 3, 6, 9, 10. Well, I wonder. Woo! Whoa, I'd never seen that before. But anyway, I've only before seen 9 of them on display. Oh, and back here, look at what's around the corner here. There's the edge of Aura C. Dyer's quilt that is on the cover of Patchwork Souvenirs. So I think that this is, the gallery was on the other side and they were showing the Century of Progress quilts. Here's Barbara Brackman. She and I were in Lexington, Massachusetts, and together we were giving a walking tour, and a woman said, I have the Frida Plume quilt. Now the Frida Plume quilt won second place, and it was from Evanston, Illinois. And I said, how did the Frida Plume quilts get here? And she said, well, she explained that the family had moved to Connecticut from Illinois, and they died, and the woman had given a box of things to her, including the quilt. We didn't know what it looked like in color. We knew it was called Delectable Mountains, and here it is. But here is where the scandal gets a little deeper. Okay. She had a letter. On the letterhead is Mary McIlwain. Now, Mary McIlwain owned a quilt shop in Walworth, Wisconsin, and she was a judge. January 1933. Now remember, the deadline is May. Dear Mrs. Plume, through Miss Wilford of the Sears Quilt Department, I received an inquiry about a quilt that you had made, the Delectable Mountains, that you wished quilted. I will be very glad to do this work for you and will endeavor to merit your approval if you place the work with me. My prices vary from $10 to $21 according to the work I put on the quilt. It might be possible that I could do your quilt for $18. I would first have to see the quilt to know what designing is necessary to bring out the beauty of the patches. If you will send it out or drive out, I will be very happy to give you an estimate. If you drive out, you can see my work. I have a very wonderful group of women, and only one quilter works on one quilt. So your stitches are uniform. It may take from 12 to 14 spools of thread, depending on the type of work. It won second place in Chicago. And look at the non-official name tag on it. Delectable Mountains, Frida Plume in Evanston. Okay, also while the exhibit was on display at the Museum of Our National Heritage in Lexington, Massachusetts, the architect came through the museum and he came out and said, "Where's the curator? Where's the curator?" I'm being told this on the phone. And he said, "My mother-in-law's picture is in there." And he was pointing to this one. And so the caption says that her name is Sue Roberts. "Oh yes, that's right." And he said, "That's my mother-in-law. What in the world is?" And so the curator called me and I got in touch with him. And lo and behold, yes, Sue Roberts was the judge, was the woman who'd organized the whole contest. She changed her name, he told me, from Ida Cohen to Sue Roberts. Sears Roebuck. Sue Roberts. And for the rest of her life, she was known as Susie Roberts. I talked to her husband, he's still alive, she has died, and he said, "I only knew her as Susie Roberts. I didn't know there was any other name until I saw the life insurance policy." She was an artist. She was trained at Northwestern as an artist, and she came to Sears when advertising had just come to its fore in 1928. She was assigned to work on the radio, and they had a home radio hour, and the idea was that you opened your Sears Roebuck, get next to your radio, sit down at your kitchen table, open your Sears Roebuck catalog. We're going to talk about this on page 23 today. Aren't those fabrics beautiful? You know, and would you like to hear about our contest that we're going to have? You need to get your quilt in here. And so this, I think, is how it got 24,000 entries, especially a large number in the upper Midwest. But what she's looking at, she's in the center, and she's looking again at that grand prize winning quilt. Mabel Langley's quilt is on the back wall from Dallas. You saw that in color, and you just recently saw the red and white Delectable Mountains on the right. Here they are up close. Sue Roberts on the far left, the second one, Mary McIlwain, the third one, and the fourth one is from the Art Institute of Chicago. And they're looking closely at the Star of the Bluegrass and not looking very happy. And I just am sure they all knew Miss Kaden and knew that she hadn't put a stitch in this. Here's Sue Roberts on WLS. She had the program. Now, WLS the call letter stands for World's Largest Store, because the radio station at that time was owned by Sears. And there she is, Sue Roberts. Now, the people who made that grand prize winning quilt, some of them saved trial samples. And this is their proof that they worked on that grand prize winning quilt. And as it turns out, because the grand prize winning quilt is gone, we can't find it at the White House or anywhere else, these become the important pieces. And you can see the trapunto, the stuffing up here was done individually. They put a gauze on the back of a piece of green fabric and stuffed each one of those with cotton. And so one woman did all the stuffing on the quilt, one woman did the piecing, one woman put it together, and it did the overall quilting. Now you can see here the colors and the print, and it's not that exciting, I think you would say, in light of the Century of Progress ones, I think. Now you're looking at something that looks exactly like the quilt. What is this? Well, Miss Kaden was not happy at all. And for one thing, she didn't apparently like the fact that the quilt was given to Mrs. Roosevelt. She wanted the quilt to be used in her shop to sell more quilts. And so she had a duplicate made, and this is the duplicate. And it's owned in the family, a niece owns it. But recently, we came upon these letters when every time, well, we've gone to the White House many times, but this is the most interesting set of letters that was found recently. It's from Miss Margaret Rogers Kaden, January 11th, 1934. And she's writing to the secretary to Mrs. Roosevelt, Miss Melvine Schneider. And she's saying, "Dear Miss Schneider, the enclosed letter, I am sure, was intended for me. It was given to me today by Mrs. Margaret Rogers, to whom it was delivered." So a letter from the White House was misaddressed, and it went to the wrong woman in Lexington. Eventually, Miss Kaden gets it. "I'm writing to you to ask you," this is Secretary of Mrs. Roosevelt, "if you will make a copy of this letter using my full name, Margaret Rogers Kaden. A letter from Mrs. Roosevelt would be a treasure to keep. And if not asking too much, and as a great favor, I would like so much to have this letter signed by Mrs. Roosevelt, our First Lady of the land. Thanking you very much, and with very best wish, I am most sincerely, Margaret Rogers Kaden," and it's signed. Now, here comes another one. Let's see, February 12th, 1934. "Dear Miss Kaden," and it's from the secretary. "Dear Miss Kaden, very curt, very short. Many thanks for the beautiful quilt. I'm very glad to have it and deeply appreciate your thoughtfulness of me. With all good wishes for the new year, I am very sincerely yours, Secretary to Mrs. Roosevelt." I am just positive that Mrs. Roosevelt knew what was going on and did not want to have any part in promoting Miss Kaden in her shop. But anyway, when we went to Lexington, Kentucky and had the exhibit on display, we showed this quilt and we showed the trial samples. I went with fear and trepidation, hoping that the people of Lexington would tell us we were lying, and they said, they just shook their head. We knew it all along, you know, it was just, the society page editor, though, didn't know about her, and she did a lot of research, and interesting research. This is actually the announcement in the Lexington paper the day that she won. "Kentucky woman wins first prize of $1,000 in National Quilt Contest at the fair." There's her check, and there's Miss Kaden. In the article, she says that she was working on a quilt. And so, you know, she perpetuates her idea that she was the creator. Here it is. At right is the creator, Margaret Rogers Kaden of Lexington. Here's her house in Lexington, purchased after the contest, but they were very well off, very good. I mean, they were very good, successful entrepreneurs. She and her two sisters. They never married. They lived here in this house. And here's Barbara and I out in Los Angeles when the exhibit was out there at Riverside, California. It was at the Gene Autry Western History Museum. They were proud to show us this quilt in the back. And Gene Autry, their curators had been challenged to find some women's things to put in here. All they had, you know, he had lots of, men's stuff. And so they were proud. They put this out, and I said, well, that's interesting. And I said, it's definitely 1833, 1933. And so we put it out. But then look what shows up at the Museum of American Folk Art in their catalog in New York City. The very same quilt. So I put the two pictures together, and there's slight differences. There's a little bit more embroidery on the one at the Gene Autry Museum. So I'm thinking, whoa, could this be a kit? And then at the American Quilt Study Group in West Virginia, in Charleston, West Virginia, this quilt showed up. Exactly the same thing. I said, get it outside. I want to take a good picture. And in the upper left-hand corner, it says 1933, Cora Tussing, Roger Tussing. An unusual name, and there's a blue ribbon here. It had also been shown in a state fair, so I knew it was Cleveland. So I went to the telephone directory in Cleveland, saw one Tussing, called, it was Roger, and I said, we have a quilt here with your name on it, and your mother's name. And he said, well, I said, do you know anything about it? And this is what he said without my prompting. He said, my father and my mother went to the fair. She was a quilter. She wanted to see the exhibit. She came home with a box kit. And so we know it's a kit. I have no idea what manufacturer it's from. I've seen 2 more on eBay, so they're out there, and it's a kit. Now this is wild. Would you agree? This was made in Florida, but the woman grew up in Illinois. Here's the state of Illinois, and that's where she grew up, in western Illinois. It says, welcome to Chicago, June 1 to November 1, 1933. World's Fair. It has Washington. It has the Chicago Fire, Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. It has a steamboat. It has the Bible. It has lots of writing on it, the Lord's Prayer. Is this wonderful? And she won a green ribbon for it in Florida. Now, I haven't done much checking on this, but it's owned still by the family. And the most interesting thing, I think, is the story that's told here. It says Mayor Anton Cermak of Chicago was shot on February, 1933. What happened was that this man, Giuseppe, fired at the president. Roosevelt had been elected, but he hadn't been inaugurated yet. He shot at Roosevelt, and he hit Mayor Cermak. And you think about that today, what the 30s would have been like without President Roosevelt. Cermak died, and he was electrocuted within a month. Why put this on a quilt that's going to go to a contest in March? I don't know. I just think it's a wonderful folk piece. Here's some more close-ups of it. 5 shots were fired by Giuseppe Zangara, and the electric chair, he was in the electric chair March 20th at Radford, Florida. So this is and look at her children's hands with rings on it. This is tied all over, it's not quilted, and it's covered with little ribbons. There's Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. So what is she commemorating here? The history of Chicago. Now, the blue fabric in this is exactly the blue fabric in the quilt on the right on the stage. So is the green. I've even identified some of the same prints. I'm wondering if they might have put out something for quilts in that era that give this kind of architectural look. Well, this is another one that the Sears Archives had. It's a great black and white picture. It was so clear that we could read the name and address on the tag in the photo. Mrs. Louise Rowley on Thorndale in Chicago. I taught in Chicago on Thorndale. I knew the neighborhood. We did a lot of, Barbara and I both worked on trying to find her. We found her in the city directory, but that's about it. So this quilt ended up in Patchwork Souvenirs in black and white only. And we used it to talk about the buildings at the World's Fair site. This is Lake Michigan. You're looking south. The Natural History Museum is right here. Soldiers Stadium is right here. Here is the Sears building. And it looks like a fabulous quilt. And in January of 1999, I was told that it was going up for sale at an auction in North Georgia, 2 hours from me. Well, guess where we went on? It was New Year's Day. We were even in the town on New Year's Eve at a bed and breakfast. The next morning, we trek off to the auction with everybody from the bed and breakfast right behind us. They wanted to know the story. They wanted to see this quilt. I wanted to see the quilt. We walked in. There it was hanging. I went, wow. I'd never seen it before. I sat down. I'd called the auctioneer before we went, and I said, "Is the tag still attached?" He said yes, and that was that. So I sat down to watch what would happen. There was somebody on the phone from New York bidding on it, and they stopped, at a point where I thought was a little too low. So I went ahead and purchased it, and I was pretty shocked, but I went and paid my money, and when I went to pay the money, they handed me a handwritten letter, a note that said, "This quilt was not made by Mrs. Louise Rowley. It was made by her son, Richard H. Rowley, who was an architect, a draftsman." Wow. And I'm going, okay. And he was afraid, this was written on there, he was afraid that the judges wouldn't believe that a man had made this. And that was that. She signed it with very big, scrawly handwriting, and it looked like Ginny or Connie Rowley. And that was that. We went home, and I began the search for Richard H. Rowley. Long story, it's taken several years. I found him in the Social Security Death Index out in California at Davis. Thought that was odd. I was out there giving a talk. One of the people took me to the Historical Society, and we found him. He and his wife had owned land there, but nobody could find where he was buried or even his death certificate. So that was a dead end. Until, how sad. So until a month ago, this is why I decided I could not just talk about softcovers for hard times. A month ago, Willeen Smith was clearing out her computer, and she said, I have a lot more databases now, and I have access to some of the census. Would you want me to check again? And one night in the course of about 2 or 3 hours, she located him, his wife, his family, in the 1920 census in Chicago. He had a family. In 1930, he's living in New York City, working as an architect in New York City without a wife. We thought that was a little wondered, but I had his Social Security application, and I'd gotten a copy of that. I matched up the handwriting, and it matched the handwriting on the tag. And I believed that since he was an architect, when I looked at and a draftsman, I could see that this does seem to be the hand, and at least in drawing, of an architect. I just could not believe that he could have made it in the 4 months' time, from January to March. And I can't believe that the judges would have overlooked something like this. Well, when I said to her, I guess I'd never said to Willeen Smith, she lives in Kansas, I said, I bought the quilt in North Georgia, and she went right to the internet. They have their public records on the internet in Georgia. She found a Richard Rowley and a Harriet Rowley. Richard had died, she knew the date. He was listed there in Georgia. I said, you got the date, you got the place, let me take over. I called the Historical Society. It was a small historical society in North Georgia, Gainesville, Georgia. They pulled off the newspapers. They had the real newspapers bound. They went to that week. They found his obituary and the place where he was buried. And so the woman said, but I don't recognize this. He died in 1968. And she said, I don't know this graveyard. And so but she said, call the funeral home. And I called the funeral home, and I said I was looking for this graveyard, and he said, oh, that's now Gateway to Heaven, and it's up behind Burger King. You can't miss it if you come. I thought he lived out in California, and here we are in North Georgia. And I said, he said, well, who are you looking for? And I said, Richard Rowley. He said, oh, I know his wife. I said, his wife. And I said, she would be 100 years old this year. And he said, well, we have her pre-burial, agreement. She hasn't been buried yet. And that's exactly right. And she is turning 100 this year. I did contact, he gave me then the name of Connie Rowley. It was Connie Rowley. And he was an incredible, this is just the beginning. He lived in New York. I bought a photo album of his work in New York in 1930. And he was a photographer, he was an architect. And I said, did he really make this quilt? And the son said, well, yes, that was always the story. I said, who saw him making this quilt? And he said his wife was there the whole time. And so that's the story. I do have a picture of him, but I didn't have it here yet for you. But another success story, and I hope there are a lot more. I hope you like this little, it was a personal trip. I wanted to share my latest discovery with you. Thank you so much.